There's a detail in Toxic Commando's story that most people just walk straight past. Before the sludge, before the wall, before any of this became a global catastrophe, someone already knew. Not a scientist, not a government agency, not some early warning system that failed. A group of people that most of us would dismiss without a second thought showed up at Leon Dorsey's operation and told him exactly what was going to happen. Word for word, location for location. They knew what was sleeping beneath the drill site, they knew what releasing it would mean, and they came specifically to stop it. Leon ignored them, you know how that turned out, but here's the thing that nobody really stops to ask. How did they know? Not in a vague, we have a bad feeling about this place way, specifically. Accurately, in enough detail that when you look back at everything that happened after October 29th, 2033, it matches what they described almost exactly. That's not a lucky guess, that's not superstition, that's knowledge. Real knowledge about something ancient that modern science didn't even know existed. So who were these people? Where did that knowledge come from? How long had they been sitting on it? And where are they now that the thing they spent generations trying to keep buried is loose on the surface? That's what we're getting into today. And honestly, the Cultists might be the most interesting and most overlooked piece of lore in this entire game. Let's start with what we actually know about them. Before the Obsidian Group's drilling operation reached its target depth, a group of people approached Leon Dorsey with a warning. They knew the exact location where the company planned to drill. They told him an ancient entity was sleeping beneath that site. They told him disturbing it would be catastrophic, and they asked him directly, specifically, to stop. Now think about what it takes to walk into a billionaire CEO's operation and deliver that message. These weren't people who stumbled across the Obsidian Group's plans and got worried. They came prepared. They came with specific knowledge about a specific location. They weren't vague about it. They weren't saying something bad might happen if you drill deep enough. They were saying, we know what is down there. We know what you're about to do, and we are telling you right now that if you do it, the consequences will be catastrophic. That kind of specificity doesn't come from a casual belief system, that comes from generations of accumulated knowledge about something very real. So who were they and where did that knowledge come from? The honest answer is that the game doesn't spell this out completely, and I actually think that's intentional. The Cultists are deliberately mysterious. Their full origin, their full belief system, the entire history of how they came to know about the Sludge God, it's left partially in the dark, but we can piece together a picture from what the game does tell us. These people had clearly been organized around the Sludge God for a long time, long enough that the knowledge of what was sleeping beneath the earth had been passed down through generations, long enough that they built an entire structure around protecting that secret and keeping humanity away from whatever was buried down there. Think about that for a second. We're talking about an ancient entity that predates human civilization, and there were already people on the surface who knew it existed, who had dedicated themselves to making sure it stayed buried. How does that happen? How does a group of humans develop an awareness of something that ancient that deeply? The most likely answer, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, is that the Sludge God was never completely inert even while it slept. We know from the drilling operation that workers near the site were seeing a demonic shape when they closed their eyes before the drill even broke through. The Sludge God was already reaching upward through the dreams of people in proximity to where it slept. If that was happening to Obsidian Group workers over a period of weeks, imagine what living near that location over generations would do to a community. Imagine growing up in a place where something ancient and vast was leaking into the dreams of everyone around you. Imagine what kind of belief system would develop around that experience over centuries. The cultists didn't choose to believe in the Sludge God. The way you might choose a religion, the Sludge God chose them. It was in their dreams long before any of them made it the center of their lives. Now here's where I want to stop and ask you something directly, because I think most people watch this story and immediately side with the cultists. Obviously they were right. Obviously Leon should have listened. Looking back at everything that happened, it seems like the clearest decision in the world, but put yourself in Leon's position for a second. You've spent years building a company. You have some of the most qualified scientists and engineers on the planet telling you the drilling operation is safe. You have investors. You have a mission you genuinely believe in. You have a real solution to a real problem that is genuinely hurting real people, and then a group of cultists shows up at your door. Not scientists, not government officials, not anyone with credentials that fit inside Leon's framework for what counts as reliable information. People whose entire worldview is built around an ancient sleeping entity beneath the earth. People who sound, and I say this not to be dismissive, but to be honest about how this would actually feel in the moment, like exactly the kind of people you've been trained your whole life to not take seriously. What do you actually do? I'm not saying Leon made the right call. He absolutely didn't, but I think it's worth being honest about the fact that most of us put in that exact situation, with that exact pressure, with that exact mission on the line, would probably have made the same decision. We would have listened politely, we would have noted it down somewhere, we would have told ourselves we'd look into it, and then we would have kept drilling, because that's how human beings work. We trust the frameworks we've been given for evaluating information. We trust credentials, we trust science, we trust the people in the room who have letters after their names. And when something falls completely outside that framework, when the warning comes from people who seem like they're speaking a completely different language about a completely different reality, most of us don't have the tools to process it properly. Leon ignored the cultists, but if we're being really honest with ourselves, would we have done any better? That's the uncomfortable question at the center of this story, and it's one of the reasons Toxic Commando works so well as a John Carpenter story, because Carpenter has always been interested in that gap between what we can perceive and what is actually real, between the frameworks we use to evaluate the world and the things those frameworks simply aren't built to handle. The cultists were operating with information that Leon's framework had no category for, and the world paid for it. And this is where St. Goddard's Church becomes really interesting. In the game, there's a mission called Church of the Damned that takes place at an abandoned location called St. Goddard's Church. And what the commandos find there isn't just zombies and infected wasteland. They find survivors, a small group of people who have held up inside the church, led by a woman named Gallagher. And these aren't random civilians who happen to find shelter in a church. The fact that the game places a significant group of survivors specifically at a church called St. Goddard's in the middle of an infected zone that everyone else has abandoned suggests this location meant something before the outbreak, that people had a reason to be connected to it that goes beyond just looking for a building with thick walls. And here's a detail worth noting. Leon's fixer, the person he hired to help cover up the disaster in the early days, is also named Gallagher. Now that could be a coincidence. Two characters sharing the same surname happens. But in a game this carefully built around John Carpenter's storytelling sensibilities, where almost nothing feels accidental, the same name appearing on Leon's cover-up fixer and the leader of the survivors, at a significant church inside the infected zone feels like it might be telling us something. Are they related? Is the Gallagher at the church someone connected to the original cover-up operation who ended up trapped inside the quarantine zone? Is there a family connection to the people who were guarding the drill site location before any of this started? The game doesn't answer that directly, but the overlap is there and it's hard to ignore once you notice it. That whether St. Goddard's was connected to the cult that warned Leon or whether it's a separate thread entirely. The game leaves that ambiguous, but the presence of organized survivors specifically at this location, specifically in this church, specifically in the infected zone, feels like it's telling us something about the history of the place. Some people knew this area mattered, some people stayed when everyone else ran. Now, here's the thing about the cultists that I think gets overlooked because of how the story frames them on the surface. They seem like the kind of characters who show up in horror stories specifically to be ignored, the crazy warning people, the ones who know the truth and get dismissed, the plot device that sets up the tragedy. And look, yes, Leon ignored them. Yes, that's what causes everything. In that sense, they serve a classic horror story function. But think about what their existence actually means for the larger lore. If there were people who knew about the Sludge God long before the Obsidian group found it, that means the Sludge God has a history on the surface that predates the game's events by potentially hundreds of years, maybe longer. There were people who encountered its influence before, people who felt it in their dreams, people who decided the right response to that influence was to dedicate their lives to keeping others away from it, rather than exploiting it. That's not a small thing. That's a whole chapter of this world's history that the game hasn't fully explored yet. What happened the last time the Sludge God got close to waking up? Was there a previous incident that the cultists formed in response to? Is St. Goddard's Church built on top of a previous attempt to contain or worship the entity? Are the survivors the commandos find there the last remnant of the original warning group? The game plants these questions without fully answering them, and honestly that's smart storytelling. It makes the world feel bigger than what you can see. There's also a darker possibility about the cultists that's worth sitting with. Not all groups that form around an ancient sleeping entity are trying to protect people from it. Some groups form to serve it. The The word cult in this context could mean either thing: a group dedicated to keeping something contained and humanity safe, or a group dedicated to the entity itself and potentially working toward its awakening rather than against it. The game's phrasing suggests the cultists who warned Leon were genuinely trying to prevent the disaster. They came to stop the drilling, not to encourage it, but the presence of a place called the Church of the Damned in the infected zone raises an interesting question. Was everyone connected to the Sludge god's history working against its awakening? Or were there factions, some trying to prevent it, some trying to bring it about, operating in the shadows long before Leon's drill broke through? Again, the game doesn't answer this directly. But the name Church of the Damned isn't exactly the kind of name you give a place associated with benevolent protective intentions. That's a thread worth pulling on. And if the game expands its lore with the upcoming update, which everything points toward happening, the cultist faction feels like the piece of the story with the most room to grow. Because right now they're a mystery with edges. We know they existed, we know they were right. We know some of them are probably still out there, but we don't know what they actually believed, what their rituals looked like, whether there were internal disagreements about how to handle the Sludge god's presence, whether some of them welcomed its awakening while others spent their whole lives trying to prevent it. All of that is still on the table. And then there's where things stand now. After October 29th, 2033, the cultists warned Leon. Leon ignored them. The Sludge god woke up. The infection spread. The wall went up. Everything they predicted happened exactly as they said it would. So where are they now? Some of them are almost certainly among the infected, the areas near the drill site, the places where people with generational ties to the Sludge god's location would have lived, were hit first and hardest when the sludge erupted. The community that had spent generations protecting the world from this thing would have been directly in the path of it when it finally got out. There's something genuinely tragic about that. The people who knew the most about the Sludge god, the people who tried the hardest to prevent the disaster, some of them are probably out there in infected zone right now as Homo Mortis, part of the army of the very entity they spent their lives trying to keep contained. The thing they protected the world from for generations turned them into its soldiers. That's a horrible ending for people who were right about everything, but not all of them. The survivors at St. Godard's Church suggest that some people connected to that history are still out there, still organized, still alive inside the quarantine zone, holding on to something in a place that mattered to them long before any of this started. What they know, what they're still protecting, what they understand about the Sludge god that Leon scientists and Project God Killer haven't figured out yet. That's the thread this story hasn't fully pulled on yet. And here's the thing that keeps nagging at me about all of this. Leon is trying to kill the Sludge god with technology, with Project God Killer, with weapons built from the Sludge energy itself. The whole approach is scientific, analytical, built from the same framework that got humanity into this mess in the first place. But the cultists had a different kind of knowledge that didn't come from science or analysis or drilling or experimentation, knowledge that came from generations of direct contact with whatever the Sludge god was leaking into the world, even while it slept. The what if killing the Sludge god, if that's even possible, doesn't just require better weapons? What if it requires understanding it in a way that Leon's framework is fundamentally incapable of providing? What if the survivors at St. Godard's Church know something that Project God Killer doesn't account for? The game hasn't answered that yet, but the fact that the cultists exist at all, the fact that there were people who knew about the Sludge god long before any of this started, suggests that the solution to all of this might not come purely from Leon's base of operations. It might come from the people who were right from the beginning, the people Leon ignored. So when you put it all together, here's what we know for certain. They had specific, accurate knowledge about the Sludge god long before any modern science detected it. They were organized enough to approach Leon Dorsey directly and deliver a coherent warning. They have a history connected to the area around the drill site that predates the Obsidian group entirely. Some of them are likely among the infected now, and some of them possibly connected to St. Godard's Church are still alive inside the quarantine zone. The rest is the mystery the game is still holding on to, and honestly that mystery is one of the most compelling things about Toxic Commando's lore. Because the Sludge god having a history that humans were already aware of, that there were people keeping watch, keeping the secret, trying to hold the line for generations before Leon's drill broke through, makes the world feel ancient and layered in a way that most zombie games never bother with. This isn't just an outbreak, it's a resumption of something that was interrupted a long time ago. The cultists knew that. They tried to make sure the interruption lasted, and one man with a drill undid all of it in a single day. That's the cultists, the people who knew, who tried, and who got ignored. the next video, we're going deep on the sludge itself, what it actually is, how it works, what it does to organic matter, and why it behaves more like a living system with purpose than a simple contamination or chemical spill. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment. Be honest. If you were Leon Dorsey in that moment, would you have listened to the cultists, or would you have kept drilling? I want to know what you actually think.